Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Joseph Metz about moral luck and responsibility for omissions.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Joe Metz, who is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Widener University. Joe works on several topics that listeners of this podcast are probably also interested in, including free will and moral responsibility, but also agency, philosophy of action, and omissions. In fact, several of his publications are about omissions in particular, including one that will guide our conversation today. That paper is called Omissions, Moral Luck, and Minding the Epistemic Gap, and it was published in the Canadian Journal of Philosophy in 2021. Thanks so much for joining us, Joe, and for being willing to talk about this paper with us. Could you start by telling us a bit about your work, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Sure. Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here. Nice to have this conversation with you all. And I've been interested in issues related to free will and moral luck and things like that. I got the bug as an undergrad. I read the Moral Luck paper by Thomas Nagel and just thought this is a huge thing that I need to think a whole lot about, and kind of went a lot from there. And in terms of omissions, that's something that once I realized that it's such this massive piece of agency that I think is being explored now, but is, I think, a little underexplored, sort of got that hook there. And so, it's been a sort of fun journey through that. And studied those topics a whole lot as a grad student at University of Arizona, and now at Widener pursuing it more.
Yeah, very cool. Well, you've argued that there are two threats to moral responsibility when accounting for omissions. One about being morally responsible for an omission, and the other about being held morally responsible for omissions. And we've talked about omissions before. Way back in season 4, we talked to John Stegall about omissions in Frankfurt cases. Before we turn to these threats to moral responsibility from omissions, could you say a bit about what you take an omission to be?
Sure. So it's an interesting puzzle because there's different fun projects to be done with omissions. And so there's sort of different definitions that people give in sort of different kinds of contexts. What I'm most interested in is the sort of negative aspects of our agency. And so you can think of it as roughly agents' failures to act. But there's other kinds of questions. There's also fun causal questions about how omissions work causally speaking. Can they be causes? Can they be effects and that kind of thing? And so that's usually more a broader view of omissions. There's also more normative loaded sort of ideas of omissions where it's more something someone was expected to do or someone ought to have done. But I'm being a bit more broad about this, just saying omissions are basically agents' failures to act, roughly speaking.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're also going to talk some about abilities. How do you take abilities to be related to moral responsibility, both in the case of actions, but then also especially in the case of omissions?
Sure. So I think abilities are extremely important for responsibility for both actions and omissions in a related but not perfectly symmetrical kind of way. Mm-hmm. And so I think abilities are a really important way of cashing out what's commonly called the control condition for responsibility, where moral responsibility is typically thought to require something like sufficient control over what you're doing and sufficient awareness of what you're doing. And that a lot of different theories hold that the way that this control is cashed out is either explicitly or implicitly tied to abilities. And so a lot of really prominent theories, including stuff like from Kadri Vivlin and a bunch of other people, like Anne Whittle, a bunch of other people, have done explicitly ability-based talk, but other theories that aren't explicitly ability-based, I think, still rely very heavily on abilities. So, John Martin Fisher's, a moderate reasons responsiveness sort of approach, where you're talking about an agent's mechanism for doing something being appropriately reasons receptive and reasons reactive, but these are basically abilities to recognize and act on the basis of reasons. Right. And so I think abilities are really foundational here. And then I think that there's a sort of asymmetry at stake here, but the idea is that responsibility for actions requires that you're relevantly able to do what you actually do. There's more to it than this, but at least as a sort of key component of it. And when it comes to omissions, basically the sort of puzzle here is that if you don't have any sort of constraint, there's a gazillion things that we're failing to do all the time. And many of these things seem to have nothing to do meaningfully with agency or praise or blame and stuff like that. Like, I'm speaking with y'all now. I'm not speaking with Abraham Lincoln. There seems like a very important difference in kind. And so, I think that we want to have some way of sort of linking certain failures to us in ways that are reflective of our agency, in ways we can be called to answer for or can be held accountable for. And I think abilities are sort of key part of that. That to be morally responsible for failing to do something, you had to be relevantly able to do the omitted act. So that's kind of the connection I go for there.
Mm-hmm.
And you aren't able to talk to Abraham Lincoln, are you?
I wish, but no, unable. Yeah, that's, my time machine skills are a little need some more practice. It's gonna work.
Yeah. Could you talk us through the asymmetry that you accept between responsibility for actions and omissions?
Sure, absolutely. So for responsibility for actions, you, I think, have to be relevantly able to do what you actually do. And again, there's other constraints on that, because there's this almost like trivial sense in which, of course, we're able to do what we actually do because we actually did it.
Right.
But there's a sense in which the kind of control we are exercising in doing what we actually do has to meet some thresholds, that it's not just pure sort of randomness or luck, although I do have another paper where I argue that can actually be pretty minimal. But that's a sort of separate thing. So for actions, you don't actually need to be able to do otherwise. I'm convinced by things like Frankfurt cases where an agent is allegedly, and I think pretty convincingly, responsible for doing something despite being unable to do otherwise. So for an example, as a Frankfurt-style action case, so suppose you have an assassin who decides to shoot somebody and actually does shoot that person, but there's an evil neuroscientist lurking in the background such that if the assassin had at all wavered in their decision, they were sort of monitoring their brain from afar, they would have intervened. But as a matter of fact, the assassin does everything more or less just on her own, and the neuroscientist doesn't need to do anything. So the assassin decides to and does kill the victim, but due to the neuroscientist is unable to do otherwise. But what a lot of people seem to think, and I agree, is that she's still responsible for that action despite being unable to do otherwise. When it comes to omissions, though, I think that there is a requirement that you're able to do otherwise, in the sense that you need to be able to perform the omitted act. A sort of corollary of this you can think of is that being blameworthy for failing to do something requires that you were able to do that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's a pretty plausible principle. This asymmetry itself, I know Taylor, you've got work on this, is somewhat controversial, but it's, I think there's some sort of further considerations and reasons we can sort of have for it. First, just on the Frankfurt literature, it's a lot less controversial. Of course, the whole literature is very controversial, but it's a lot less controversial to give a Frankfurt-style action case than it is for an omission case.
Right.
People tend to be a lot more skeptical of those kinds of cases. It's also, it seems to violate odd implies can in certain ways that we seem to find plausible. So if I want to blame the assassin for killing the victim, she was still able to do the thing that she actually did. If I want to blame someone for failing to do something they were unable to do, that violates odd implies can, or at least it seems to on a fairly standard reading of it. And so, I mean, there's also sort of classic cases that Fisher gives his classic sharks case of, and I think it's helpful here just because a lot of my other cases are sort of similar to this, but a guy sees a kid drowning at the beach and he decides not to rescue that child, but it turns out that there were hungry sharks in the water that would have eaten him if he had tried at all to save that child. And so maybe he's a bad person, maybe he should have tried to save the child, but he's not blameworthy for not saving the child, in part because he wasn't able to do so. If we take away the sharks and make him able to do so, then it seems like he is blameworthy, at least fairly standardly. For all of these cases, of course, there's controversies, but the sort of standard analysis is that, he would be blameworthy.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's switch gears now and start talking about moral luck. We've talked about moral luck in some earlier episodes of the podcast, too, including back in season 1 with Dana Nelkin. But for those who are unfamiliar, could you say a bit about what moral luck is and what kinds of moral luck you're interested in.
Sure. So moral luck, as a general sort of phenomenon, results from a tension in sort of two widely sort of held, deeply intuitive beliefs that people tend to have. So the first is sometimes called the control principle, which is the idea that you're only really responsible for your behavior to the extent that it was under your control. That if you did something as a result of, say, a muscle spasm, or that it was sort of like someone had puppeted you, or that if you had been severely manipulated or coerced in some significant kind of way, you're not really responsible for your behavior in that sense. And that really the key is that you are sort of the author of these sort of behaviors. But then the tension is that there are lots of other cases where we think people have different amounts of blame, but for factors that seem to differ just purely based on luck or sort of external, sort of outside of the agent considerations. So following sort of Nagel's kind of classic taxonomy of this, there's usually divided into 4 categories of luck. So the first, and the one that people I think worry about the most, is what's called resultant luck. So the luck in the outcomes of our behaviors. So the classic example of this is that you might have 2 people who drive drunk. So they both do the same extremely reckless action. And they both, say, swerve onto a sidewalk and then get back on the road. But only one of them actually hits somebody. They're unlucky that there's a pedestrian on the road. A lot of people still want to blame the driver who actually kills someone more than the driver who doesn't. But whether or not that driver, or whether or not the pedestrian was really there, that's just a matter of luck and the sort of outcome of that action. It's just sort of a matter of stuff outside of their control.
Right.
And so there's this tension because we can't obviously square those 2 things without doing some massaging or at least making some major revisions, or what some people do is just reject one of these sort of sets of intuitions completely. But so resultant luck gets a lot of focus and recognition for good reason. But I'm interested in 2 other kinds of moral luck here more, because I think they're particularly concerning from the perspective of omissions. I should say very briefly also that there's causal luck, the luck in the sort of ultimate causes of our actions. I think that that's extremely relevant to, or either very relevant to, or depending on your analysis, just reduces to puzzles about free will. And this is one of the reasons why moral luck is often so closely associated with issues of free will, is that they're both viewed as serious threats to the legitimacy of our holding one another responsible, of our being responsible, of things of that nature, sort of serious threats to responsibility. But for the other 2 kinds of luck that I'm going to focus on more here, I think that there's a special sort of set of concerns that comes up for them that hasn't fully been appreciated. And so in my paper, that's what I argue, that basically there's some dangers we might not have fully noticed or appreciated yet. So one of these kinds of luck is called circumstantial luck, which is luck in your circumstances. Luck, you can think of it as like the moral tests that you face. So someone who grows up in Nazi Germany and becomes an SS officer has failed the moral test. And maybe if they lived a life, say, in contemporary United States, they wouldn't have done anything nearly that bad, and so they wouldn't have failed that test. It's just a matter of whether or not they face those circumstances. And then sort of conversely, you might have someone who lives an ordinary life now, but would have become an SS officer had they been put in those circumstances, but they just got lucky that they never faced that moral test. And so there's this sort of worry that if we're going to blame people for luck in their circumstances, we're blaming them for stuff that's outside of their control. And then the last kind of luck is what's called constitutive luck, luck in our constitutions, luck in what sort of character traits we're born with, luck in also maybe the malleability of these things, such that 2 people might work equally hard at becoming more generous, but one of them has a significantly harder time. We might judge one of them for sort of being cold-hearted when it's maybe outside of his control, that that's a trait he was born with, and that it's harder for him to, say, improve in that aspect. And the sort of puzzle here, and the sort of motivation for this paper more broadly, is that once we start paying attention to the ways that omissions and luck can interact, and in particular omissions, abilities, and luck can interact, we can start to see that there's more of a tension with circumstantial and constitutive luck and sort of this control principle than we might have previously thought.
Mm-hmm.
So here are some cases to kind of motivate this a bit more. So I call these asymmetric abilities cases because the idea is that you have two agents who fail to do something, presumably about the same thing, but there's a difference in their respective abilities to perform the relevant behavior. So as our sort of first case here, I call this pair of cases epilepsy and no epilepsy. So in epilepsy, we have Ephraim sees a drowning child in the ocean, but he decides he really likes sunbathing on the beach more instead, and so he decides to stay on the beach. But unbeknownst to him, he secretly has epilepsy. He's never had any sort of seizure before, but in this particular case, if he were to try to rescue that child, he would have had a seizure, he would have been unable to move, and so actually he lacks the relevant ability to rescue the child. Just to say a little bit more about abilities here, there's different ways of carving up abilities, but the sort of standard analysis that I follow is that it's helpful to distinguish between an agent's internal capacities, sometimes called their general abilities, something like their physical skills, know-how, capacities in a sort of sense like that. Not just physical, could also be mental or other kinds of, but again, internal skills that they have. And then there's the external features, which are the agent's sort of opportunities. And so the idea is that the relevant abilities for responsibility are presumably specific abilities. So it's a combination of the general know-how and capacities combined with the opportunity to exercise those capacities. And so Ephraim has the opportunity to save this child, but he lacks the sort of internal features, the internal abilities, the sort of general ability to actually rescue the child in this case. And given what I've said about responsibility for omissions requiring being able to perform the omitted act, he's not able to rescue the child. So in virtue of that, he's not responsible for failing to save the child. Now, as a rival case here, consider a case of no epilepsy. So we have Nina, who sees a different child drowning in the ocean, and she also decides to sunbathe on the beach and doesn't jump into the water, doesn't try to do anything, but she didn't have epilepsy. So she was relevantly able to save the child. She had the opportunity to save the child, but she didn't. And so assuming that she's, again, relevantly aware that other conditions for responsibility have been met, she's blameworthy for failing to rescue the child in a way that Ephraim isn't. So they both fail to rescue the child, but the responsibility differs in virtue of their abilities, in particular their general abilities. Now, as another kind of pair of cases, sometimes you have people with the same internal abilities, but different external opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so, imagine you have Heathcliff seeing, again, a child drowning in the ocean. He decides to sunbathe on the beach instead, and the child drowns. He seems perfectly blameworthy for that. Again, sort of no extenuating circumstances and stuff like that. It's pretty standard judgment. But now imagine, say, Catherine, who is at a different beach. She thinks a child is drowning, but it's just, actually there's no child there to drown. But she had decided anyway that I'm not going to go into the water. I'm going to ignore this, what I believe to be the sound of a child drowning, but actually say it's like some kids playing, no one's actually drowning. Both Catherine and Heathcliff believe that there's a child drowning. They both decide to stay on the beach, but only one of them, only Heathcliff, actually had the opportunity to rescue a child. Catherine didn't. She would have failed that test if she had been in those circumstances, but she wasn't. Her circumstances were just substantively different. And the connection with moral luck here is that I argue that these pairs of cases are actually just instances of circumstantial and constitutive luck. So sort of working backwards, taking the Heathcliff and Catherine cases, the sort of child, no child, present cases, they both failed to do something. They both failed to rescue a child that they believe is drowning. Mm-hmm. But only one of them actually faced that moral test. And so it seems like it's kind of a matter of luck that Heathcliff is blameworthy and that Catherine isn't. Whereas in the case of epilepsy and no epilepsy, that's a case of constitutive luck. It's luck in their constitutions, luck in this case of their physical constitutions. And so the idea is that Ephraim is not blameworthy for failing to rescue the child because constitutively, through no fault of his own, he has epilepsy and wouldn't have been able to actually rescue the child. In contrast, Nina was able to rescue the child, and so due to a difference in their internal constitutions, they are, there's a difference in moral responsibility there. And so the sort of tension here, just to sort of bring this back, is that, again, if the control principle, the sort of idea, sort of one half of the sort of puzzle for moral luck, that we're only responsible for what we have control over is correct, we shouldn't get a moral difference between the cases of epilepsy and no epilepsy, or child and no child. But now I'm biased, but I think intuitively, at least these cases are at least somewhat plausible that we'd want to blame we'd want to blame Nina and not Ephraim, and we'd want to blame Heathcliff and not Catherine, in virtue of the differences in their internal abilities or their sort of opportunities. And so it seems like we have a case where we're judging or making different moral judgments on the basis of a difference in factors outside of agents' control, in particular with respect to their constitutions and with respect to their circumstances. Now, what gets sort of special about omissions here is that asymmetric abilities cases only come up in the case of omissions because you're looking at agents' unexercised abilities. Because anytime you're looking at an agent's actions, you're looking at other things, but you're also looking at, importantly, what they actually did, what their exercised abilities were. You're not going to get a case where you have two agents who do the same thing, but only one of them was able to do it.
Right.
So it wouldn't work that way.
Yeah.
But in the case of omissions, two people can fail to do something, and you can have a big difference in their abilities, and you wouldn't even necessarily know it. So there's this sort of puzzle that if we're only focusing on responsibility for actions, it's really easy to miss these kinds of cases. And historically, a lot of the work on moral luck and moral responsibility in general has focused on actions. And I'm not saying that that's in principle a mistake, but that omissions, I think, shed a lot of really important light on this because our agency has a really important negative aspect to it. And that if we're not, we blame people for failing to do stuff all the time, and we think that's an important part of our practices. We think that that's an important part of how we navigate the world. And so these kinds of cases only show up in omission cases. And so it turns out that actually, if we want to get moral luck right and appreciate the kinds of threats to luck, we should appreciate the omissions and the impact that they have on it. And so sort of building on this, it's not just that, we can always cook up weird cases and, but the worry is that it's not just these cases. It's actually pretty easy to generalize this kind of case. In fact, you can take any time an agent fails to do something and just add in another person who either was or wasn't able to do the relevant action, right, either due to luck in their circumstances or luck in their constitution. And so it's really easy to generate tons of these cases, and that this might happen all the time. We blame a surgeon for failing to successfully perform a surgery. Depends on whether or not he was actually able to do it, but you could easily add in another surgeon who either was or wasn't, depending on what you're holding fixed there. But it's very easy to get two people who failed to do the same thing, but only one of them was able to do it. Whether it's it's even a matter of luck, whether it's hypothetical or actual, what ends up actually happening in those cases. Yeah. So that's the kind of concern, is that this kind of circumstantial and constitutive luck end up being rampant for omissions, not just because there's more of it, I think there is, but because it can arise in a special kind of way for omission cases, but not for action cases. And so it's not that we should ignore the actions, it's just that the holistic picture of moral luck should include serious consideration of how our omissions impact them.
Yeah, so it's like almost that we're morally responsible for way, way, way more omissions than we are for our actions.
Yes.
That's like a big deal.
Yes. So part of the puzzle, and I think abilities can again help here, but you're absolutely right. There's way more stuff that we don't do that we were able to do. And so the thought is, well, does this mean that we're suddenly rampantly responsible for so much more omission, so many more omissions than we really thought? And abilities can help here a little bit, because although it's true that there are lots of things that I'm able to do right now that I'm not doing, I'm only able to really do one or maybe a few of them at a time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so it's not really like I'm responsible for doing this or that, this and this and this and this, but rather sort of a disjunction, the sort of disjunction of all the things I was able to do. But yeah, I think once we take this seriously, it does really open up the scope of responsibility more, and that I think that that's actually really important, and that actually does reflect our agency.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you talk about the difficulty moral luck for omissions poses to our existing solutions to the problem of moral luck?
Sure. So I think that this has an important impact on the existing solutions because, again, I think constitutive and circumstantial luck are not always given the full weight that they in fact deserve. So one kind of standard response to moral luck as a puzzle is that we basically say that luck just sort of ruins moral responsibility, that just it completely undermines the legitimacy of our moral responsibility practices, and that we have to kind of give an error theory for basically all of it. And I think that, yes, this is a tall order to try to give an error theory here, but the error theory has to do more than just what it previously had to do. But with these kinds of cases, intuitively and for other theoretically backed reasons, I think it's quite plausible to say that Ephraim is not responsible for saving the child, whereas Nina is. And if moral responsibility practices are fundamentally mistaken, we need to be able to explain that intuitive difference. We need to the error theory needs to be able to do more to explain that difference. So it puts pressure on that kind of solution there. Mm-hmm. When it comes to another solution is that basically morality is luck free, and that while we're somewhat concerned with moral luck, really if we're really carefully attending to it, we can understand that actually we should sort of be able to remove luck from the equation. And again, I think that sort of, if constitutive luck and circumstantial luck are more pressing than previously appreciated, it's harder to sort of do away with those. Again, I'm not saying that there aren't answers that these theorists can give. I think, again, there's some really interesting nuance here, but just that it's more pressure to give an answer. Mm-hmm. A third view, and I think the view that's maybe threatened the most by this, differentiates between resultant luck and circumstantial and constitutive luck. And it basically says that resultant luck is a problem, but that constitutive luck and circumstantial luck are not substantive threats to responsibility once we really appreciate them. And what I'd argue with these kinds of cases is that actually resultant luck and circumstantial luck are worse than we thought once we start paying attention to omissions a lot more. Right. And so it's harder to say that these threats can be discounted. For the last view, the thought is that we can find a way to sort of make morality not immune from luck, and that luck is just a part of our moral practices, and that that's what it should be. And the idea with this is that resultant luck, is just a part of our moral responsibility practices, same for circumstantial and constitutive luck. And here I'd just say that, again, if circumstantial and constitutive luck are more threatening than we previously thought, then it's harder to just accept them as part of our moral responsibility practices. So again, I think there are different answers these theorists can give, but I think it's more of an answer than maybe previously appreciated.
Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. Well, we've been talking about moral luck and omissions as a problem for kind of accounting for responsibility for omissions, being responsible for not doing things. But we want to turn now to this issue of holding others responsible, being held responsible, and doing so legitimately. So how do omissions complicate our practices of moral responsibility, of blaming each other, holding each other accountable?
Thanks. So I think omissions, again, have a massive impact here, in part because of this earlier asymmetry I was mentioning between actions and omissions, where responsibility, again, for an action, I think, does not require the ability to do otherwise. So you're really looking at what agents actually do and the abilities they're actually exercising. In the case of omissions, you're looking at what they were able to do instead, including the relevant omitted act. And so you're looking at responsibility for unexercised abilities. And so the puzzle here, or the sort of challenge for holding one another responsible, is that when you're blaming someone for an action, you're looking at what they actually did, and that's a lot easier to see. Omissions you can't see. And so you have to look at what their unexercised abilities were. And it's a lot more likely that we're going to make mistakes in assessing someone's omissions than we are for an action, just because, again, you can't see the omission. So or rather, you can't see the unexercised abilities. And in a certain sense, you really can't see the omission either. So just to use those cases I was mentioning earlier, for the epilepsy, no epilepsy case, people are going to see two, bystanders on a beach sunbathing instead of, rescuing a drowning child. They're going to think that these are two equally blameworthy, omissions. They're going to think that these are two equally blameworthy failures, but actually there's a mistake there. If Ephraim started having a seizure on the beach, it would become a lot more clear that he was unable to save the kid. But if he's not, you're not going to see that, and you're not going to know that. One kind of common sort of thought, though, is, well, maybe we could just get away with just blaming people for being bad people or things like that. And it's not that this is, a mistake. I mean, they are bad people. But it seems like a huge part of our moral responsibility practices is not just assessing character, not just saying that this is properly attributable to you, but that really that this behavior meaningfully reflects your agency in a way that I'm going to hold you to account, not just as a person, but for this particular thing. And so, sure, Ephraim and Nina are terrible people, but Ephraim's not blameworthy for his omission, even though bystanders are probably going to get that wrong. And so, sort of the converse case in the no child case, Catherine, who has no drowning children near her, people aren't going to know that she's, believing that she's not rescuing a drowning child. They're just going to see someone sunbathing and not think anything of it. But more broadly, anytime you're assessing somebody's, responsibility for their omissions, you've got to understand what their unexercised abilities are. And sort of building on this, I was looking this up last night just for some more stats on this, but people are really bad at assessing the abilities of themselves and others, particularly the unexercised ones.
Yeah.
So there's been some psych studies. So there's a classic like Dunning-Kruger stuff where most people think that they're who are really bad at something think they're way better at it than they actually are. Right. And there's the stuff where most people think they're above average drivers, even though we can't all be. But saw last night, 72% of people thought that, like in a cage match with a rat, that they could beat the rat, but 6% of people thought they could beat a grizzly bear. And so they're vastly overestimating their ability to, defeat a grizzly bear in one-on-one combat, unarmed, whatever combat. Or like 1 in 8 men in a survey in England thought that they could beat Serena Williams for a point in a tennis match. And it's just, so again, we're not so good at assessing the abilities of ourselves or others. Right. And I mean, these are sort of comparative and kind of silly cases, but even for something where that someone generally has a skill set in some capacity, you might not know in the moment whether they're actually able to do some relevant thing that you're blaming them for. That maybe on the best day, some surgeon can save somebody's life. But if they're going through some sort of life crisis, and if, say, they've developed a very slight tremor in their hand, maybe they don't have the skills that day. And so you might not actually know whether they're relevantly able to save some patient, even though it's very tempting to blame them for not saving somebody. And so the sort of worry here is that when we're assessing responsibility for omissions, we're a lot more likely to make this kind of mistake. It just doesn't show up in action cases because you're only looking at exercised abilities, and those are way easier to see.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what do you think the best response is to these threats?
So I think first it requires a sense of humility, that we have to just acknowledge that when we're trying to assess someone's responsibility for an omission, it's not that we can never do it, just that it's worth taking some extra time to really think about what their capacities are in that moment and what their opportunities really exactly were in that moment. And, it's sort of recognizing that there is an error here so we can, in principle, get better at avoiding it, but also just recognizing that in assessing responsibility for omissions in general, again, in addition to this caution, just recognizing that it's a sort of bigger topic than I think is commonly given sort of full credit for. And so as you were just mentioning, Matt, there's a whole lot there's so much stuff. Once we start really appreciating omissions, they're everywhere, or depending on what you think they are, maybe nowhere if they're not things, but there's lots and lots and lots of them. And that we should, that's an important part of our agency, but one that we should really carefully, pay attention to. And that when we're theorizing about responsibility, when we're theorizing about free will, when we're theorizing about moral luck and sort of threats to responsibility, we have to pay attention to omissions and not just actions. And it's really exciting to see that there is so much new literature on omissions, because for a long time they were often treated as an afterthought. And I think that that's a mistake. It's not that actions aren't important. It's just that omissions bring so much to the table too, that we're leaving something really important out if we don't, include that as much as well.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier with just moral responsibility for omissions, being responsible for them? Do you have any thoughts there about the best way to go for people responding to this problem of moral luck? Do you have a preference, one strategy over another? I know you talked through several different options.
So I don't have an established view on this, but the way I would think to make progress would be to treat constitutive luck and circumstantial luck much more like resultant luck. So whatever you say about one, you've got to say about the others. And I think the solution isn't that all of our moral responsibility practices are sort of fundamentally mistaken. And so it's a matter of, again, either just sort of accepting luck in our practices, which I think is probably what we actually do. Yeah. And I think that's the one I sort of lean towards the most, or it could be some sort of way of showing that we're immune from luck in all of these cases. But I think treating them together is the sort of way forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Joe, and for talking through all these different issues. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
So my website is joseph-metz.com. And I put all my papers and stuff there. And that's the best place to reach me.
Cool. We'll link that.
Yeah, thanks again, Joe.
Thank you.
In our next episode, we'll talk about group responsibility and historicism, and we'll have two guests, Stephanie Collins, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Monash University, and Niels de Haan, Lecturer and Researcher in Philosophy at the University of Vienna.